Hello, today we're going to be talking about giving effective feedback. Giving feedback is one of the most powerful ways to influence people's behavior. So, it's a leadership course. We're talking about influencing people towards a goal. Feedback is a way to influence people's behavior. Many of us avoid giving feedback, especially critical feedback, because it makes us feel uncomfortable. I had a roommate in grad school who was not very conscientious about doing his dishes in a timely manner. And instead of going up to him and having a discussion with him about this, I just over time built up this self righteous contempt where I had this story in my head that I was the greatest roommate ever because I did my dishes in a timely manner, and he was the great Satan because he didn't, right? And I just kind of let it build up inside me until I snapped at him one day, and he had no idea where it was coming from because instead of bringing it up when it was first became an issue, I let it build up over time. And we often do that. Instead of giving people feedback about their performance, we don't give them feedback and then we hold it against them that they're not changing their behaviors. But he had no idea that he was bothering me by not doing his dishes more quickly, right? I hadn't given him that feedback, so he didn't know. I ask students why they think it's difficult to give people critical feedback, and I almost always receive the same response, which is that I don't like conflict. I try to avoid conflict, and I think that is part of the story, but I don't think that is the whole story. I think that a big reason that people avoid giving critical feedback is that when you give people critical feedback, it's actually a very vulnerable thing to do for the person giving feedback. When you give people critical feedback, essentially what you are saying is, I need something from you that you're not giving me. Like with my roommate with the dishes, I needed a clean kitchen to feel comfortable in my own home. I needed a clean kitchen to be able to cook my meals. I needed something from him. And by giving him critical feedback on that, I was essentially asking him to do something for me. And we don't like to ask people to do things for us. That makes us feel vulnerable. And you can see this when you're on a group project and you have a group member that's slacking. Instead of addressing that with them explicitly, instead, what you often do is think to yourself, I don't need them. I can do it myself. And that's essentially the exact opposite of vulnerability, right? Vulnerability would be, hey, I need your help to get this project done. Can you please improve your performance? But by saying, hey, I can just do it myself, you're taking this kind of invulnerable, I'm strong enough, I don't need other people's help kind of stance. So I do think avoiding conflict is a part of it, but I also think that giving other people critical feedback makes us feel vulnerable because we're asking for something. Today we're going to talk about 6 characteristics of effective feedback. The first is to establish trust that you have the other person's best interest in mind, to pick a time where they are emotionally ready to receive feedback, to begin by listening to the other person's side of the story, to praise more than you criticize, to give smart feedback, and then to agree on smart goals so the person knows how to improve going forward. We'll start by talking about establishing trust. When I'm talking about trust in this scenario, what I mean specifically is the other person has to believe that you have their best interests in mind when you're giving them feedback, that you care about their performance, their improvement, whatever it is. And that is why you're giving them feedback, because you have their best interests in mind. That sounds really obvious, but there are actually a lot of reasons that we give feedback, and few of them have to do with having the other person's best interest in mind. So one reason we give feedback is to show off how smart we are, to show that, hey, we know how to do something better than you. The perfect example of this is people that are pedantic. Pedantic people don't actually care about improving your grammar or your pronunciation or whatever it is that they're critiquing. They just want to show that they know some esoteric language rule that you don't. They want to show off how smart they are. And that's why we find pedantic people so annoying, is because we know that they're not giving us feedback because they care about us. They're giving us feedback because it's an opportunity for them to show off. Another reason we sometimes use, quote, feedback as an opportunity to vent when we're frustrated with people. I had a teaching assistant at one point in time who she just gave me so much attitude whenever I asked her to do the simplest thing. She'd just be like, oh, like I was asking her to do something completely inappropriate. And everything I asked her to do was well within her job description. So during the middle of the semester, I brought her in for an evaluation, and it was this like half-hour meeting where I essentially just vented at her about how frustrating she was and how much she irritated me and everything she did that bothered me. As you can imagine, the second half of the semester was much, much worse than the first half of the semester, and she just completely disengaged and gave up on me. It is okay to vent about people that frustrated you. Do not vent to the person who frustrates you. That's not conducive to improving their performance. That's not conducive to improving your guys' relationship. You should focus on behaviors, focus on making the other person perform better when you're giving feedback, not to make you feel better about being frustrated by them. Um, if people don't trust your motivation for providing feedback, then they become defensive. Um, and instead of listening to you and being open to changing their behavior, when they feel like they're being attacked, then they defend their behavior. And if they're defending their behavior, if they're justifying it or explaining it, then they obviously can't be open to changing that behavior, right? So when people feel attacked, they get defensive and then they're not open to change, which is the exact opposite of what you're trying to do when you give people feedback. You're hoping that they will be open to change. So establish trust by having the other person's best interests in mind. The next aspect of giving effective feedback is to pick an appropriate time for that feedback. In a perfect world, you give people feedback as soon as possible after the behavior that you are trying to change. So I have a cat. If I'm gone for the day and I come home and he has scratched up the couch sometime during the day, it doesn't help to punish him when I get home, right? He doesn't see the connection between the behavior, tearing up the couch, and the punishment. He thinks I'm just being a jerk for no reason, right? So ideally, you give people feedback as soon as possible after the behavior. One of the reasons for this is that you don't want someone to continue doing something the wrong way. If you've ever had like a annual or semi-annual performance review and your boss gives you feedback on something and you've been doing something wrong for the last 6 months and he waited until this performance review to tell you, it's incredibly frustrating because you feel like, man, I mean, I wish you would have told me a long time ago so I could have improved my performance. I could have started practicing this new way instead of just waiting until this time and letting me continue to screw up over and over again. That being said, you want to wait until the person is emotionally ready to receive feedback. So sometimes people, when they screw up, they know they screw up and they feel really upset or angry or sad or vulnerable. That's not a great time to give negative feedback to people or critical feedback to people. Wait until they are in a place where they are emotionally ready to receive that feedback. To give effective feedback, we establish trust that we have the other person's best interest in mind. We pick a time when we try to give them feedback as soon as possible, but we wait until they're emotionally ready to receive it. And then the next step we're going to talk about is that you begin by listening. You want to hear the other person's side of the story. When you give feedback to people, you want to begin by listening. I know that seems counterintuitive because we think of feedback as telling other people things, right? But when you begin by listening, you hear the other person's side of the story. You get important context that you might be missing. I kickbox, and when you spar in kickboxing, it's actually a lot safer to spar with someone who's really, really good at kickboxing because they're very controlled. They know what they're doing. They know how to hurt you without injuring you. When you're sparring with new people, they get angry, they get scared, and they're often out of control, and that's when injuries happen. So it's more dangerous for both people to spar with someone who's inexperienced. There was a new guy in our class, and he had kind of been bugging me to spar with him, and so I finally agreed to do it. And a big part of my motivation for doing it was to help him improve his sparring, to get a little bit more control. So I knew I was kind of putting myself out there, risking myself getting injured by this person that didn't have a lot of control, but I was doing it to try to help him. We start sparring. He throws a kick at me, and I block it, and it breaks his toe. Because he kicked me with his foot. You're supposed to kick with the shin, and he kicked with his foot, and he broke his toe. The next day, I go into the gym, and my trainer walks up to me, and without saying anything, just starts reaming me out for breaking this kid's toe, for being reckless, for injuring him, and then he just walks away. And he never even asks me to hear my side of the story. He never wants to know how things looked like from my perspective. He just jumped to a conclusion about what happened. Obviously, I felt like I was treated really unfairly in that. That made me upset. So listen to people before you start giving them feedback. The other great thing that listening does is it helps you identify the emotions of the person. So remember, we talked earlier that you don't want to give feedback to people unless they're in a position where they are emotionally open to it. So by listening to them first, you can pick up on their emotional state and decide if now is the appropriate time to give them feedback. Lastly, the kind of like social judo trick of listening to the other person before you give them feedback is that it allows them to bring up problems so you don't have to. People are surprisingly self aware. Often they understand what their weaknesses in performance are. They know what they've done wrong. So if you ask them, hey, how was your performance last quarter? How do you think you did on that presentation? How do you think you did on that report? They will often bring up their own shortcomings so that you don't have to. And now suddenly, instead of you criticizing them, it becomes a discussion about what they can do to improve. People are much more open to criticism if they criticize themselves as opposed to being criticized from the outside. So when they say, hey, I felt like my slides were really disorganized in my presentation and that's something I want to improve on, you can say, oh yeah, I noticed that same thing as well. Let's talk about how you can improve on that going forward. So by listening, you allow them to bring up issues so that you don't have to, and it makes them feel less like they're being attacked by you. So far today, we've talked about establishing trust so the other person knows you have their best interests in mind, picking a time when they are emotionally ready to receive that feedback, beginning by listening to their side of the story. And the next thing we'll talk about is praising people more than you criticize them. So make an effort to praise people more often than you criticize them. Let people know what they are doing right more often than you let them know what they're doing wrong. The human psyche is such that we always look for the shortcomings. We always look for the space between where we are and where we want to be, no matter how small that space is. And we just tend to tell people when they mess up in some way, and yet we're not as forthright about telling people when they do things right. We just kind of take it for granted that they should do things right. Don't take other people's good performance for granted. When they do something well, tell them they do it well. And then that way, when you do have to give them critical feedback, they don't feel like you only notice when they screw up. They don't feel like you're attacking them. You've built this foundation of trust where they know that you recognize what they do as well as what they need to improve on. When you get really good at giving people critical feedback, you can do it in a way where you're highlighting people's strengths through the critical feedback. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I have a voice that is perfectly suited for a lecture hall. I can be in a lecture hall of 300 people and the person way in the back can hear me perfectly, even without a microphone. That is a talent for a professor. That is a drawback in other parts of my life, like when I'm trying to have a quiet conversation with my girlfriend. And I was at my girlfriend's apartment one night, and she has a roommate, and we were staying up late. Her roommate had already gone to sleep, and I was emphatically talking to my girlfriend about something using my bellowing professor voice. And she leans in and she goes, Tommy, you're just, I know you're so hyper masculine and you just have this hyper masculine, loud, booming voice. Can you try to tone it down a little bit? She said it less sarcastically than that. But I'm always kind of insecure about my loud voice because when people point it out, I feel like I'm being inconsiderate. I feel like I'm being rude. And the way she brought it up was it's complimenting this aspect of myself, my manliness, my masculinity, as well as criticizing, or not even criticizing, but giving me critical feedback. And she wasn't being insincere about the manliness part, right? So when you can give people feedback like that, they're more likely to accept it. And there's a saying from Confucius that people's strengths and weaknesses belong to a set. And what is meant by that is that in certain situations, behaviors are a positive, and then in other situations they're a negative. For example, people that are incredibly organized are also usually inflexible. People that are very disorganized are often very mellow and go with the flow. So it's not that being organized is a good thing or a bad thing, it's that being organized is good for some situations and not as effective in other situations. And so when you're giving critical feedback to people, think about when is this behavior that I am critiquing, when is that a positive? How is that a positive? And how can I frame my feedback in a way where it highlights the positive aspects of this behavior, as well as giving kind of some feedback about how it can grow or be improved. The other reason we want to focus on giving praise more than critical feedback is because praise is more effective than criticism in changing behavior. The human psyche is set up in a way where we always focus on what we're missing, on what the shortcoming is. And because of that, we often focus on giving people critical feedback, on focusing where they need to improve instead of praising where they are already successful. And the irony of this is that praise is more effective for shaping behavior than criticism is. There is a nonprofit organization here in San Rafael called Guide Dogs for the Blind, which, wait for it, trains guide dogs for the blinds. And they used to use both reward and punishment to shape the dog's behavior. And it took about 20 weeks to train a guide dog using this method. And a few years ago, they switched. They quit using punishment with the dogs, and now they only use rewards. They only reward the dogs for what they do well. They don't punish them for when they mess up. By switching to only rewarding the dogs for positive behavior, they dropped the training time in half, from 20 weeks to 10 weeks. And one of the reasons for this is that the dogs used to not want to train sometimes because it felt like work to them, because, hey, they might get punished doing it, right? When they switched to only using rewards, the dogs always want to train because it's just an opportunity for them to get lots of treats. And so we need to focus on praising people, not just because people are sensitive and we have to make them feel good, but also because praise is an effective way to shape their behavior. If you only provide negative feedback to people, it makes them feel helpless. It makes them feel like they can't do anything right. They did a study back in the 50s or 60s where the psychologist took two dogs and he put them both in metal cages, and then he connected the metal cages to an electric generator. And he could turn on the electric generator and electrocute the dogs in the cages. He also put a big button in one of the dogs' cages where if the dog hit the button, it would turn off the electricity for both cages. So he turns off the he turns on the electricity, and the dogs go crazy. They're jumping up and down and barking and whining. And just by coincidence, the dog with the button in his cage will hit the button and it'll turn off the electricity. You do that a few times in a row, and the dog with access to the button very quickly learns to hit the button as soon as the electricity comes on to stop the electricity. Meanwhile, you can imagine what the other dog has learned to do. The other dog can't turn off the electricity. The other dog has learned to just lay there and get shocked and just take it, just accept the pain. Now, this very sadistic psychologist takes the dogs and he switches the cages. And the dog that previously didn't have access to the button now has access to the button. He turns on the electricity, and that dog that now has access to the button, he still just lays there. He learned that he couldn't affect his environment, that no matter what he did, he would have to sit there and get shocked, and so he just gave up. This should sound very familiar to to anyone that's ever had a boss that only gives them critical feedback. It is incredibly demoralizing to only be told what you are doing wrong, and eventually you're just going to give up, that you're going to quit trying, you're going to quit putting effort in, because no matter what you do, you're going to get critical feedback. Now, we're talking about how powerful positive feedback is, and because it is so powerful, you need to be very sincere and honest with your positive feedback. When I was a young child of 8 or 9 years old, My grandmother got me this, hideous sweater. But of course I was old enough to know that I was supposed to pretend like I liked it. So I opened the box and saw this hideous sweater and pretend like I liked it. And more than that, every time I went over to my grandma's house that year, my parents made me wear that sweater so that she would be happy. Well, you can imagine what my grandmother got me the next Christmas. It was another, I don't know if it was another ugly sweater, but it was ugly clothes. Every Christmas, she would buy me ugly clothes and I would pretend that I liked them. And the reason why is because I kept telling her that I liked them, right? I kept giving her this positive feedback. And because it was insincere, I ended up rewarding a behavior that I didn't want to reward. So far today, we've talked about establishing trust, let the other person know you have their best interests in mind, picking a time when they're emotionally ready to receive feedback, begin by listening to the other person's side of the story, praising more than you criticize. And the next thing we'll talk about is giving smart feedback. When you give people feedback, you need to give it with the same level of specificity and measurability and all those other things we talked about in regard to SMART goals. You need to do that with feedback as well. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we spent a whole lecture talking about SMART goals. But let me just give you an example of what I mean. This is very vague feedback. You left lab equipment out. That's very vague. SMART feedback would look like this. After lab on Tuesday, you left 3 volumetric pipettes out on the counter in the wet lab, and I wasted 15 minutes looking for them at 8 a.m. on Wednesday. So you can see, just like SMART goals, our feedback here is very specific about what happened, when, who, why it's a problem. We don't have a deadline per se, but we talk about the time of when this happened. This is quantifiable, 3 volumetrics, 15 minutes. And it focuses on what was the consequence. Why is this a problem? So this is what I mean by smart feedback. I do want to talk a little bit about what I mean by relevant feedback because that is very important. First of all, feedback needs to be relevant to job performance. I have a colleague who is responsible for finding clients for one of my leadership courses. We do group projects, and she's responsible for finding clients. And she writes all of her emails in bright blue Comic Sans, which drives me nuts. I find it very unprofessional. And I want, I like want to tell her like, no, you need, for my class, you need to use like black regular font. However, she does a great job finding clients, and the clients always speak really well of her. She is very good at her job. And so what business is it of mine what font she uses in her emails, right? Now, if she were struggling to find clients and I thought it was because she was being unprofessional, then maybe that's a discussion we could have. But if someone is doing their job well, then let them do it. Robert Frost said, you can tell a man what to do, but don't tell him how to do it. If someone is performing well, let them do it the way that they want to. Give them the freedom, the autonomy to do it the way they want, as long as they are being successful. Make sure that your feedback is relevant to job performance. By relevant, I also mean that that feedback should focus on behavior, not character. There is a big difference between telling someone, hey, you're really messy, and telling someone, hey, your desk is very disorganized. One of those, the hey, you're very messy, that's attacking someone's character. And any time that you attack someone's character, they're going to defend themselves because they feel like they're defending who they are. So of course they're going to defend themselves. When you criticize behavior, then that's something that's a little bit easier to change. We don't identify as much with our behavior. We don't consider our behavior ourselves the way we think of character as ourselves. So when you critique people's behavior, they feel like they can change it. When you critique people's character, they feel like they have to be defensive. Lastly, make sure that the feedback is relevant to what the person is trying to achieve. So using another kickboxing example, I train with a lot of different partners, and invariably they give me feedback that, oh, hey, you're doing this wrong with your punches, or you need to work on this with your kicks. And they're absolutely right. They are 100% accurate about all the things they critique me about. However, it's really difficult to learn a new skill and get good at it, and I am doing lots and lots and lots of things wrong. both with punches and kicks. And each day I can really only focus on one or two things to improve on. And so they might give me feedback on something that I'm not working on that day. And so, yes, they're right. And yes, it's accurate feedback, but it's not very helpful because I only have enough bandwidth to deal with one thing at a time. And that's outside of where my focus is. So make sure that when you give people feedback, it's relevant to what they care about, their performance expectations. So far, we've talked about establishing trust so the person knows that you have their best interests in mind, picking a time when they are emotionally open to receiving feedback, beginning by listening to their side of the story, praising more than we criticize, giving smart feedback, and then the last step is to agree on SMART goals. It is very cruel to tell someone what they are doing wrong and then not tell them how to improve it. When we agree on SMART goals, we give people a path forward to be successful. It's not, hey, these are your shortcomings and this is what you're bad at, and all right, that's it. It's this is an area for growth, and this is how you can achieve that growth. Let's set a goal for performance improvement. Let's create a path forward so you actually improve. Let's not give the critical feedback and then just end there. And of course, we use the SMART goal structure in order to do that. I've talked a lot about giving critical feedback today because I think people struggle more with giving critical feedback than giving positive feedback. But I've emphasized giving praise, and in regard to SMART goals too, when you set SMART goals for performance improvement, focus on building strengths as well as addressing weaknesses. Make people feel as if they get to flaunt their strengths with their goals, not just address their weaknesses. So whenever you're making SMART goals for people, make sure you have goals that focus on building their strengths as well as addressing their weaknesses. Today we talked about giving effective feedback, and I gave you 6 characteristics of effective feedback, which are to establish trust that you have the other person's best interest in mind, pick an appropriate time to give them feedback where they're emotionally capable of receiving it, begin by listening to their side of the story, be sure to praise more often than you criticize, give smart feedback so they understand exactly which behavior is the problem, and then agree on SMART goals so you give them a path forward to success. And that's how you give effective feedback. Now that you know what good feedback sounds like, feedback that's delivered in a less than optimal way is going to drive you crazy. So it becomes up to you to become the more emotionally mature person and to guide the other person into giving you feedback in an effective way. So if you're really upset, if you're busy, if now is not a good time for you, and someone starts trying to give you feedback, ask them if you guys can talk when it's better for you. Don't be afraid to ask that. Use all your listening skills that we talked about, so asking open-ended questions, using restatements, so that the person clarifies their position and they feel heard when they give you critical feedback. A lot of times when people give you critical feedback, it's less about changing your behavior and it's more about that venting aspect of just wanting to be heard. So a lot of receiving feedback is really just about validating the other person's perspective. If they critique your character, if they make some claim about you being lazy or thoughtless or messy, whatever it is, ask them for a behavioral example. Be like, okay, what exactly are you talking about? What behavior do I do that is actually bothering you? Ask the person what you can do differently going forward. So say, okay, this is what's bothering you. This is what you're critiquing. How can I improve? How can I be better going forward from here? And then lastly, don't be afraid to ask, hey, is there anything I'm doing well? Is there anything you like about what I'm doing? What can I continue to do that you appreciate? And that will show you that they do appreciate certain things that you're doing. There are aspects of your performance that they recognize and appreciate. So ideally, other people have these skills when they give us feedback, but that's often not the case. And now that you do have these skills, it often becomes your responsibility to be the more emotionally mature person. Structure the conversation in a way that it is beneficial and helpful to both parties. The last thing I want to say in this lecture is work on giving better feedback to yourself. We often have self-talk. We criticize ourselves in ways that we would never talk to other people. We are so thoughtless and disrespectful with ourselves sometimes in a way that we would never be to another person. Um, the same structure that I laid out for giving feedback to other people, use that to give feedback to yourself. If you only ever focus on your own shortcomings, if you get to the end of the day and all you do is beat yourself up for the mistakes you made, and you never focus on what you've done right and what you were successful at, then that is just as demoralizing as if you have a boss that is doing that. So all of these steps that we talked about today in regard to giving effective feedback to other people, give yourself that same courtesy. Treat yourself in the same way as you would treat other people in regard to giving them feedback.